All right, jaysanalysis.com. Welcome back. This time we're going to dig deep into Plato's Republic, probably the most famous of the Platonic corpus. Plato's theory of man, society, reason, order, law, meaning, all coalesce in the Republic. So we're going to start with Book 1 and work our way through. Don't know how long that's going to take. Probably not too long because most of the books can be summarized and commented on relatively simply, I think. Excuse me. So we're going to be looking at 428 to 348 BC here. And there's going to be different discussions with different persons in each of the books that will focus on different topics. So we're going to discuss different forms of government. What Plato thinks is the best form of government, as well as metaphysics, because for Platonism, of course, metaphysics informs all these other areas of life. So we'll start here with the discussion with Glaucon. Is one of the characters who's going to figure prominently in the discussion. And for Book 1, however, when I take that back, it's going to be Thrasymachus. So Book 1 is going to be the interaction with the sophist and nihilist Thrasymachus. They're going to figure out which form of government is better. So democracy is going to come up in Book 1. But before we get to that, maybe just a brief overview, the introduction to the copy that I have by the classicist GMA Grube. He writes, philosophy for Socrates seems to have consisted almost entirely in examining people concerning justice, piety, courage, moderation, wisdom, friendship, and other conventionally recognized virtues. He is always asking them TSD, that is, in the Greek, what is it about each one of them? And he seems to presuppose that there are definite unique answers to these questions, that justice, piety, courage, etc. have some definite property or universal of form, whose nature can be captured in a unique definition or account. And for reference there, he cites Euthyphro, which we analyzed 2 lectures back, Euthyphro section 6. And as I pointed out in many of these discussions, that is, of course, the classic elenctic method. Dialogue, Q&A, back and forth. Question, assumption, answer, etc. So knowledge, again, for Plato, is the solution. Man's problem is ignorance. And so ignorance is the means or the defect which brings about ill living, vice, etc. And so dialectics are heavily at work in Plato. And it's through dialectical reasoning then that we get back to the truth in Plato's mind. The Grube comments again. Plato suggests that the use of dialectics and the preoccupation with definitions is let me read this. That seems to be one reason why dialectic, which is a descendant of the Socratic elencus, the elenctic method, must be practiced only by mature people who have mastered the mathematical sciences. Interesting comment, because he was saying that the youth who are not mature will utilize dialectics for the purpose of ill-gotten gain or destruction. And so the sophists basically use word play and dialectics as a trick rather than as a means for arriving at the truth, and I think that's correct. So when we're dealing with relativism and the sophists out there in the world, they're using a lot of word smithery and trickery, bad rhetoric ultimately, to try to obfuscate rather than to arrive at the truth. So that's a good point that we can take here from Plato and from the introduction by Grube. Later on, the Republic will make an argument for a tripartite soul or psyche, which is interesting. This is hearkening back to the original Pythagorean idea of the primeval triad, if you will. So from the monad comes the dyad, and from the dyad and the monad together comes the triad. So Plato will apply this to the human psyche. Quite different from the Eastern theological approach of a tripartite body, soul, and nous. Sometimes people mistake the two and confuse them. I've had discussions with Platonic scholars, Platonists, that think that when the Eastern view of the nous is being mentioned, that it's the tripartite view of Plato's Book 4. That's not what's being discussed. Two different views. The Eastern theological anthropology is based on the biblical view, what Paul speaks about in his epistles. It is not based on Plato's view. Might be a little bit of similarity there, especially in terminology. Nous, N-O-U-S, of course, is used in both cases. These are not the same thing. So, again, two different views. Be careful not to confuse these. So they're not talking about the same thing. In Eastern theology, the nous is a means, a faculty, which God has given man, a natural faculty, which God has given man to know God. In Platonism, nous is the means by which the rational mind perceives the higher intellectual, intelligible forms. So two different things there. So Cratylus will be a person that Plato will deal with. This will be important because Cratylus is the Heraclitean philosopher. Heraclitus said, of course, that everything is in flux. Everything is in a constant state of flux. No fixity, no stasis. All is flux. And so this will fit, of course, well with the sophist's view that everything's relative. And this fits, of course, well with modernity. These are the people that we constantly encounter, the people that think that nothing is true. Everything's relative, everything's subjective. You can never know. So a lot of what's going on in the Republic will be combating that faulty philosophy. So allegories will come up. The sun, the allegory of the line, allegory of the cave, which will divide reality into the intelligible and the visible, sensible realms. And the error of the sophists and of the naturalists and the Heracliteans for Plato will be the error of mistaking the divide or the difference between those two. Two will be conflated into basically materialism. The one and the many, which of course comes up quite often in the papers and arguments and talks I make, which ultimately revolves back around the question of transcendental arguments. The one and the many. How is it that we can speak of a thing being singular and also being multiple? Foundational Platonic question. So this will be important, which we highlighted in a previous talk, one of the other dialogues which dealt with this. So as I mentioned, Pythagoreanism comes up. Pythagoreanism is important. And it should be mentioned as well that the absolute simplicity of Plato's view of the monad is one of the chief difficulties, I think. And Grube mentions that the Platonic forms seem at times to have some of the traits of the Parmenides view, the Parmenidean view of being, where ultimate being is an absolutely simple, indistinguishable sort of ocean of being, the one. So other elements of Pythagoreanism come into this. Number and ratio will be key to reality. Archytas himself, for example, among many other significant achievements in mathematics, and mechanics discovered the ratios that underlie the relations between the successive notes in enharmonic, harmonic, and chromatic scales. This will be, of course, where we get the trivium and the quadrivium from classic pedagogy. Plato thought that the forms could be satisfactorily defined, not in terms of sensible properties, but ultimately in terms of numbers, ratios, and mathematical notions. There's relative truth to that. I think that's kind of true. Ultimately, numbers I don't think are the end-all, be-all, because numbers are impersonal. And in my philosophy, my worldview, which is still theological, of course, ultimate reality is personal. It's not an impersonal force or principle. It is personal and it is rational. So that's why we can have the idea of the forms, universals, intelligible, sensible, and the immaterial, all grounded in the divine. But as we know, ultimately the Republic is not just about speculative metaphysics, it is about government and society. Plato did not go to Sicily to found a heaven on earth. He was much too hard-headed for that. But he surely thought that he had something to teach Dionysius that would prove of real political significance. Throughout the Republic, he insists that the ideal city he describes is possible, and that it could be realized if a king became a philosopher, or if a philosopher became a king. The philosopher king at the top of the hierarchy in the Republic. And so ultimately, this is proof that the world needs to hail me as the king of the world because I am the philosopher king. Ha ha, kidding. We will see a tripartite structure consistently throughout the work. As mentioned before, I have an entire paper on triadic structure in Homer and Plato, which I will perhaps link below this. But the gold, silver, bronze idea comes in where we have a gold civilization or city, which is the highest based on rational ideals, objective principles. We have a silver society, city, based on drives of the body, economics perhaps. And then we have a bronze society, democracy, based around the basest drives possible, democracy. So these correspond to three kinds of humans and three kinds of desires. We have the idea that appetitive desires, food, drink, sex, spiritual desires, honor, victory, war, heroes, etc. And then there are rational desires for knowledge and truth. So there you can see the tripartite structure at work. Philosophy, of course, reigns supreme over all the other possible outlets or ways of living or what you might do in life. Philosophy is superior to engineering. It's superior to warfare. It is the highest of the tree, the totem pole, if you will. Because without forms, knowledge is impossible, and only the philosophers have access to the forms. Why is that? Are they special? Well, in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no. I mean, they are humans, as the rest of humans are humans, but philosophers are interested in what's true. And truth, of course, is what keeps us from living ill and from self-destruction. So the more that we buy into lies, the more destructive we are to ourselves and to society as a whole. And that's ultimately why this matters for the philosopher. Money lovers, honor lovers, and philosophers have different conceptions of what the good or the happy life consists in. And the reason they have these different conceptions is because of a difference in the structure of their desires. To be crude about it, Grube says, what we think the good is depends on what we want. Hence, people who want very different things will have very different ideas of what the good is. This is, of course, the reason why there's so much friction in the world, is people have false and erroneous notions of what the good is and how to live. So the allegory of the cave will come up, of course, and I'm sure most people are probably at least roughly familiar with what the allegory of the cave is. To make a long story short, there are basically 4 stages here. So in stage 1, the prisoners at the bottom of the cave are completely uneducated. They are ignorant, and they are bound by their unnecessary appetitive desires. So they're ruled by base desires, and they see the images of things presented by their senses as all there is. Boy, is that true. Stage 2, when they have been appropriately educated in a craft of, say, music or poetry or some sort of physical training, some of these prisoners are released from the bonds of unnecessary appetites and are then ruled by necessary appetites. So you kind of move up the scale here of enlightenment. They then see that the models of things of which they previously saw only images. So it's kind of moving up the chain of being, if you will, because when you, say, study music or you're studying some art, you realize there's more going on here. You know, it's not just about eating and drinking and bodily pleasures. There's a world that evidences structure, aesthetics, being, meaning, truth, knowledge, etc. So we're pointing us in the direction of higher things, in other words. And so aesthetics is very important in that. Stage 3, through education in mathematical science, some of those people are released further from the bonds and are bound by their spirited desires. They escape the cave and see things as they are in themselves. So we're going further into enlightenment. Stage 4, through education in dialectic and practical city management, some of these people take the final step. They escape the bounds of these spirited desires and become ultimately ruled only by the rational desires. They see that the greatest object of study is the good itself, and they see that it is in some way the cause of all the other good things they've seen. And thus the philosopher king. So in Plato and Socrates' mind, it is thus the philosopher who is sort of at the top of this pile, top of this heap, because he's interested in what's true. He's seen through deception, he's seen through bodily, baser instincts as the highest form of living, and even beyond generic categories like honor and courage, into peering into the divine itself. And that's ultimately, in a way, we could read that in a Eastern theological sense, in terms of the goal of Eastern theology, of course, is to actually see God face to face. We think of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who, Jesus says basically that you will see God face to face, right? So that comes pretty close to the Platonic idea of seeing the true and the good in itself. But again, of course, for Plato, that beatific version is seeing impersonal principles, whereas in Eastern theology, it's actually seeing God face to face, who is personal, right? So we're not just communing with the number 1, the number 7, right? We're actually communing with a personal hypostasis in the Greek, a personal being. So in Book 1, some have thought this to be a separate Platonic dialogue, not part of the Republic, just called Thrasymachus, but it's just traditionally included. There's a discussion of old age, bodily burdens, etc. That's kind of boring. We won't talk about that. But the question comes up, as we saw in Euthyphro, what is justice? And the answer that is given by Cephalus is speaking what's true and paying one's debt. So of course this gets criticized as not an adequate definition of what justice is, and that will lead us into the deeper questions as the Republic goes on. So the beginning theme is about democracy. And there's a discussion, Glaucon is mentioned coming up again as he was in a previous dialogue. The source of democratic politics. So the philosopher is going to go down and talk amongst the people and see what the people think. What do the people say about government and how it should be organized and structured and run? The democratic man. And the answer that comes out of this beginning discussion is that, well, those with power are set over against those with knowledge. So we have two options here. We can either go with people who kind of have the might makes right position. If you've got power, then you win. That's who should rule. Or those who have knowledge. And this will set the stage for the rest of the Republic. Glaucon makes the decision that in the might makes right position set up, the philosophy and the philosopher are not put in their proper place. The philosopher has wisdom. And in a democracy, which is essentially what a might makes right position is, right? So doesn't it just have to be might makes right in the sense of one guy? It could be might makes right in the sense of the majority, the tyranny of the majority. Democracy, for a long time has been called the two wolves and a sheep arguing over what's for dinner, and of course the two wolves are going to win in that bout. And that's essentially what's going on in this discussion. So Thrasymachus comes into play here. He's going to be our sophist. When the question, what is justice, arises, in the Republic will begin dealing with the question of the focus of man's desires in terms of the individual and in the society. So we're taking that one and the many issue and we're applying it to the social order, and we're saying that what humans are after, what their desires are, of course, is going to be the ultimate motivating factor for the direction that a society moves in, whether positive or negative. How does that society want to project itself into the future? Well, it's going to be based on the overriding philosophy and the desires that society has. And so self-destructive or destructive societies will move in a direction that's based on falsehood, is kind of what Socrates is going to be getting at here. Societies geared towards moving towards the true, with at least some sense of virtue, will make progress. In the same way as the individual will make progress as he's directed towards what's true as opposed to what's false. Techne, which is the Greek word for craft or science or technology, comes into this. Cephalus, sort of a representation of the old, because he's the old man. The old traditional religion, the Homeric ideas, have to be cleared away. And this will bring in the new. And this is represented by the character of Polemachus. So all these different people kind of milling about and discussing with Socrates these various questions. But there is a sense which is why some have made the argument that Platonism is, in a way, a rational step away from the more primal Homeric traditions. So the Greek religion is undergoing a sort of a phase of rationalization. So for Socrates, being just is what truly makes man a social animal. So justice has a social aspect to it, and we would agree with that, as does a personhood. There's no such thing as persons that exist in absolute vacuum isolation. It's always in some social setting. As we said, arete in other discussions comes up. Arete is a virtue. Virtue is a thing's usefulness according to its purpose. Thrasymachus is compared to an animal. He's beastly because he's the sophist. The sophist is the naturalist, the relativist. The sophist doesn't care for any objective truth. He does not believe there's such a thing. And as we saw in a couple dialogues back, Socrates refuted the sophist. This also happens in the dialogue Lesser Hippias, which I have studied, but I've not done a discussion on yet. But Lesser Hippias is basically just an extended dialogue with a sophist. So Thrasymachus will take the place of the sophist in this dialogue, and he's also described as a nihilist, right? So because when we're asking the question of what justice is, or what the good is, or what virtue is, when Thrasymachus says there's not really such a thing, they're just whatever each man wants them to be, then he pretty much leads to nihilism, and that's what comes up in Lesser Hippias as well. Socrates points out that philosophy is nihilistic. And Socrates' goal here in this discussion is to take the young guy, Polemarchus, and make him into a philosopher, right? So it's kind of competing philosophies are being debated here in the presence of a young guy, and everyone's kind of trying to win him over. And so sophism is directly connected to nihilism. The nihilism of the sophist falls in on itself. Sophists are antithetical to the social, right? So because virtue for Socrates is connected with a man operating according to truth in the social sphere, positions that are nihilistic and sophistic and relativistic cannot function in the social sphere. And thus, relativism and nihilism are socially destructive philosophies and ideologies, which are, this is, by the way, as I've highlighted in many pieces, why they are unleashed in psychological warfare to destroy societies. So all of this is known by different power elites and oligarchs. And that's why relativism is promoted in the universities, because it is a self-destructive philosophy. It's like a wrecking ball, in the same way that cultural Marxism is a wrecking ball to the social order in terms of the arts and society. In the same way, individuals who are sophists and nihilists become toxic and destructive to the social order. And so thus Thrasymachus is critiqued as being a man who's focused on the concrete, the immediate, and he's against abstract thinking. He's a total pragmatist. And that's really all that's left if you take that view. Might makes right. So that it all goes together. If relativism is true, well, might makes right. My rules and whatever I can impose, and screw you if it screws you over, right? So it's basically a screw it all philosophy and screw everybody philosophy. Thus, it's the philosophy of the criminal. And a society of criminals cannot be a coherent, viable social order. Humans cannot interact and engage in commerce and exchange of ideas and the arts and all that in a society dominated by criminals. It's really that simple. Interestingly, Thrasymachus thinks of rhetoric like a Homeric battle. It's just an impassioned demagoguery, right? So we think of the French revolutionary characters, or an Asian provocateur who just hypes up the mob for the purpose of some sort of destructive action. And this is why democracy and demagoguery go well together. Because rhetoric is not viewed as an art where you are trying to convince people of something true. It becomes advertising. Advertising, right? So rhetoric for the sophist is advertising. It's marketing, propaganda. No connection to the truth, merely imposition of will to power. This is why Thrasymachus says, rulers make justice. There is no justice. It's whatever the rulers say. So it can be right to kill one day and wrong to kill the next day, whatever the ruler's whim is. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. And Socrates goes on to demonstrate that he's not like that, because if he were just concerned with his own bodily desires, he would take money for the lifestyle that he lives. And Socrates did not take money. He would preach and teach his philosophy openly and freely. And since he doesn't charge money for engaging in discussions geared towards getting to the truth, Socrates says to Thrasymachus, I don't really fit in your paradigm. So how would you explain me not charging if there's no such thing? If no one really cares about the truth, then I would just make money off of this. There's no such thing as truth. This leads to Thrasymachus bringing out the ad hominems. A flurry of ad hominem attacks, which is standard if you've ever had this kind of debate, and as I've had many times. You make a good point. You can expect to hear how diabolical a character you are. Usually it's people who don't even know you anyway. So being and seeming. This is the difference between Socrates and Thrasymachus. The sophist thrives on ambiguity and lies and things that seem to be deception, whereas Socrates is interested in being. What is objectively the case? What is true? What is the reality of the situation? Not the false propaganda matrix constructed about the situation according to the sophists. So then, Thrasymachus, no one in any position of rule, insofar as he's a ruler, seeks or orders what is advantageous to himself, but what is advantageous to his subjects, the ones of whom he is himself the craftsman. For it is to his subjects what is advantageous and proper to them that he looks, and everything he says and does is for them. So that is Socrates' argument as to what the ruler ought to be. And for Thrasymachus, it's merely self-interest. He also makes an interesting point that good men actually don't desire to rule. It is clear then, Thrasymachus, that no craft or rule provides for its own advantage, but as we've seen for some time now, it provides and orders for its subjects and aims its advantages of the weaker and not the stronger. So might makes right, he's saying, is not true in any other craft. If a person builds, say, a house or a building, some sort of structure, a bridge, the bridge is not built on the principles of, the builder imposing might makes right. Right? He's operating according to objective principles of mathematics, of what's true and false, right? If he doesn't, his bridge is not going to work well. It's going to fall apart. All right, so he's bound by principles. The house builder, the architect, he's bound by principles that are above him. And in the same way, a ruler is bound by principles above him. He can't just make society into whatever he wants to, because when he does, that's a tyranny. And surely everyone would object to a tyranny. And so Socrates is making just the great classic argument that one reason we know relativism isn't true or sophism isn't true is that nobody wants to be under a tyrant. And if you don't want to be under a tyrant, then that suggests that tyranny in position of might makes right is not true or good. So I don't know how much clearer that argument could be. It's a relatively simple argument. But most people, as Socrates is pointing out, and this is correct, most people are trapped. They are trapped in the cave, and the cave is intimately associated with enslavement to egoism, narcissism, and baser desires. And all of the people enslaved to that, of course, think that they're God. They view themselves as the ultimate arbiters of truth, and unfortunately don't realize that it's to their own detriment. So I have many articles and pieces where I outline that as well. And over time, Thrasymachus becomes what we say, or what we call epistemically self-conscious. As Socrates argues this position out with him, he shows Thrasymachus that the starting point that you have in philosophy, what you believe, it actually leads to the position that there's no reason to believe in virtue at all. And if there's no virtue at all, nothing right or wrong, then it doesn't matter, and anything goes. If anything goes, then you really don't have any reason to be for or against the tyranny. So, by the end of it, he says in the book 1, Thrasymachus agreed to all this, not easily, as I'm telling it, but reluctantly, with toil, trouble, since it was summer, a quantity of sweat gathered, which was a sight to behold. And then I saw something I thought I'd never see, Thrasymachus blushing. Because I finally, he says, convinced him that virtue and wisdom, that justice is virtue and wisdom, and injustice is vice and ignorance. So Socrates basically says, I finally refuted the relativist, right? And this brought out he was sweating it pretty hard. Socrates has a tendency to make jokes every now and then. It's pretty funny. But he says, yeah, I smashed the guy in the debate. He was sweating it, and he finally caved. Not because of might makes right, but because it's true. He says, now if justice is indeed wisdom and virtue, it will easily be shown to be stronger than injustice, right? And that's why the truth wins, is because truth is stronger than error. So concluding with book 1, we have an interesting, excellent statement here, which reads, come then, complete the banquet for me by continuing to answer as you've been doing. We have shown that just people are cleverer and more capable of doing things, while unjust ones aren't even able to act together. For when we speak of powerful achievement by unjust men acting together, what we say isn't altogether true. They would never have been able to keep their hands off of each other if they were completely unjust. But clearly there must have been some sort of justice at work amongst them that prevented them from doing injustice amongst themselves at the same time as they were doing it to others. He's talking about a cabal of evil men conspiring. And it was thus that this enabled them to achieve what they did. When they started doing unjust things, they were only halfway corrupted by their injustice. For those who are all bad are completely unjust and are completely incapable of doing anything. These are the things I understand to hold, not the ones that you first maintained. We must now examine, as you proposed before, whether people also live better and are happier than those that are unjust. And because all men, he says later, desire happiness, it becomes a question of whether wicked or evil or unjust men are deceived. And I think ultimately, yes, that's true. They're deceived into thinking that the incorrect, the wrong pathway, the wrong means to achieving some end are what will make them happy. And that's what the key is, right? I mean, every criminal thinks, well, if I rob this bank, it'll make me happy in the long run, I can get away with it. And he has deceived himself by thinking that this is the means to achieving what will make him happy. So that is the conclusion then of book 1, and in book 2 we will move on to more questions of the city, and we'll have an interesting esoteric aspect of the magical rings, secret societies. Yes, you heard me right. Magic rings and secret societies in book 2. Moving on to book 2, we're going to get really deep and really esoteric here. Things get pretty crazy in book 2. The discussion is about the city. So this is what's going to lead us into the construction of the ideal city, the republic as it should be. And we're going to get all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't know how else to describe it. We're going to get into the Greek mysteries here, the Hellenic mysteries. But, so multiple levels at work here. We're looking at allegorical tales. We'll have mention of, as I said, the Ring of Gyges, the mythical tale of the magic ring that would quite clearly, I would say, inform Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings trilogy. So we'll go into that, and we'll look at the tripartite hierarchy that will structure the Republic between the working class, the guardians, and the philosopher kings at the top. We'll also have the one and the many playing into this construction in terms of metaphysics and epistemology, which I said before is one of the central questions of Platonism. So, Glaucon introduces a sophisticated division of goods into 3 classes and asks Socrates which class justice is in. So of course, Socrates places it in the highest class, but the response to this question by Socrates is not complete until the end of book 9. So this will constitute the majority of the body of the Republic, is these issues that are brought up here in book 2. So the first step in this response is to shift the debate from individual justice to political justice, how the ideal polis or city, Kalopolis, is in theory. It's constructed on the basis of an argument that concludes book 1, and having located justice in that city, he will look then for it in the soul. So the macrocosm corresponds to the microcosm. This is the key here. What's happening on the local miniature scale is applicable to the wide, broad, large scale. And that principle of macro-micro is very common in Greek thought, Hellenic thought. And of course it would go into forming the Eastern theological approach to Christology. So if you've read Maximus the Confessor, you know that Christ is the microcosm of the macrocosm. Now, early on, we have in book 2 the mention of the Ring of Gyges. And this is a story that's told to illustrate morals and how power can go towards corrupting morals in an individual who has power. And the story is that, let's see, I'm going to read a summary of it here so I don't have to read the whole thing. In Glaucon's recounting of the myth, an unnamed ancestor of Gyges was a shepherd in service of the ruler of Lydia. After an earthquake, a cave revealed a mountainside where he was feeding his flock. Entering the cave, he discovered that it was in fact a tomb with a bronze horse containing a corpse of a giant, more or less, much larger than a man, and he wore a golden ring. Glaucon pocketed the ring and discovered that it gave the power to become invisible. He then arranged to be chosen as one of the messengers who reported to the king as to the status of the flocks. Arriving at the palace, he used his new power of invisibility to seduce the queen, and with her help, he murdered the king and himself became king of Lydia. Now, in one level, the allegory, the what we call in hermeneutics the anagogical level is the level of tropological is the level of moral tale. And the moral tale level here is that the invisibility of the body should lead to the focus on the soul. But of course, in the unjust man who has power, the invisibility of the body leads to the case of what happens with the ancestor of Gyges. He uses that power to murder the king and install himself as king. So power in the hands of the unjust man leads to destruction. Power in the hands of a just man, as Socrates will go on to say, can lead to the blessing of the city, the wise ruler. Now, in an esoteric sense, I would venture to posit that more is going on. Now, of course, I think everyone would laugh at this and say, well, that's just a mythical tale. Is it? Why is it a giant? We know that giants are mentioned in Scripture in Genesis 6. I have many articles that discuss this. Is there a case to be made for the possibility of an actual interbreeding of the angelic and the human in terms of the malakim in Genesis 6, the Hebrew word for angel? That's what it is. So I have always tended to not accept the argument that Genesis 6 is the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line of Cain. And one of the chief arguments against that view is the book of Jude, because the book of Jude explicitly says that the angels violated their proper and natural habitation and were punished severely for this. And the book of Jude cites the book of Enoch, and the book of Enoch is precisely about Genesis 6 and the fallen angels interbreeding with the human females. So the comparison is made in Jude to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, or of bestiality, where in the order of nature, beings are commingling with other beings lower than them in an improper, unnatural fashion. Right? So, man and man engaging in sodomy, or man and animal engaging in sodomy, is likened to the angelic engaging in illicit rights with humans. So, if one chooses to take the rationalist approach to that, well, out with the book of Jude. So that is no longer true. Now, many do go that route. But this has, of course, been a long time debated theological speculative topic. Another argument I've made for a while now is, even if this seems outlandish, right? I mean, it's, in one sense, okay, yeah, it does sound kind of outlandish that this would be going on. We have these weird offspring, giants, whatever, which would result in the flood, Genesis 6 through 10, of course. But isn't it odd that we live in a time, where all these mythological things are now realities? Take the ring of Gyges. Invisibility. There are plenty of YouTube videos that will show you the latest in military warfare technology that demonstrate the possibility, or the power, the potential, the ability even of, reportedly, of invisibility cloaking technology, from fabrics to advanced sort of encasings that can cloak entire sides of tanks and so forth. Now, that 200 years ago would have sounded like impossible, magical, fantastical, mythological technology. and yet it now exists. Similarly, with cross-species genetic engineering, that now exists, something that would have been considered mythological 100, 200 years ago. So the great irony here, of course, to the so-called rationalist is that, well, all of these mythological things seem to be coming true. Now, that doesn't function necessarily as a proof that, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, these things existed. I suppose the paleotechnology debate is still up, still an open question. But, it could be. It could be that there was once a time when there were giants. It could be that, based on the mythology of pretty much every ancient culture, the gods did visit at one time. It's an open question. So I'm not saying that means we should believe Eric von Daniken and chariots of the gods or whatever, but I do think it's an open question. And one of the reasons I think that is that all of the advanced technology it really is, I think, based on these secrets that are in ancient philosophy and mythology, as crazy as that sounds. And I've highlighted this many times with issues from the Platonic dialogues, where we saw in Phaedo Socrates discussing higher dimensions, discussing the light spectrum being far beyond what we see with visible sight. The Timaeus, in terms of the Platonic solids, describing accurately the molecular structure of reality and possibly even the subatomic. So how that is, who knows? When any of the rationalists are able to explain to me how Socrates was able to know that, then I will consider the question of paleotechnology a closed case and solved. But as of yet, I've not seen anyone explain how that is. So, what does this ring of Gyges mean? I don't know. In Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, I've made the argument for a long time that the message is kind of the warning of technology, right? So the humans who have knowledge but are not perfected in virtue are going to build a hell world, right? So that's what the Eye of Sauron is. It's this tower that's like a panopticon that surveils everything and ultimately is going to enslave Middle-earth. And Sauron, formerly good guy, when he turns bad guy, what does he do? Well, he genetically engineers a orc-elf hybrid, the Uruk-hai, to go be the foot soldiers of Sauron, and he creates gunpowder and the war machine, and that's explicitly referred to. So Tolkien is definitely pointing out sort of the war machine, the military-industrial complex, building the great panopticon tower, Eye of Sauron, and that's what's going to basically enslave the globe, and that is the Ring of Powers warning. And isn't it interesting that that's exactly what Gollum and Frodo find? It's a magic ring that makes you invisible that they stick in their pocket and keep secret, just like the Ring of Gyges in Plato's Republic Book 2. So make of that what you will. I have another piece that listeners might want to check out if they haven't, called The Mystery of the Serpentine Mirror. And in that piece, I cite some relevant references to the fall of man that are encoded in mythology. So it's not just a matter of biblical texts describing the fall of man or the mixing of the gods and men. It seems to come up in the book of Daniel, the Watchers. It seems to come up in Genesis 6. And another piece I did titled The Mysteries of Egypt. What did I title? The Mysteries of God, Egypt, and Energy. And what I did in that article was look at the Egyptian view of some of these esoteric principles and how that would actually sort of explain the path of energy, right? Electricity. Electricity flows in this sort of circular pattern. It's an open or a closed loop, right? Energy is in its flow. And so it's a ring, right? And when you stop that flow, power goes off. Otherwise, it's according to Tesla, it's an alternating current. Now the ring, the circle, this is crucial to Greek worldview, to Greek thought, to Hellenic thought. Their whole worldview is essentially based around this circularity, and this is why they have a cyclical view of time. They don't believe in a linear view of beginning, middle, and end. It's very much focused on the eternal. So to sort of flesh this out, because what we're going to have after this is a mention of Orpheus, the rites of the dead for the Greeks in that day, and the mysteries of the Orphic hymns, the Orphic mysteries are important for understanding Plato. Some have even argued that Platonism is Orphic in its origins. That could be the case, right? And the Orphic mysteries would also go back to Egypt, right? So the descent to the underworld and the return, that's a cyclical journey. It's mirrored by the sun's course around the earth, and we have nighttime, and then daytime comes back. So that journey to death, nighttime, and return to daytime resurrection. Cyclical pattern. Time and aeon, snake and egg. This is why Plato speaks of the universe as a giant Ouroboros. It's a big snake eating its own tail, because it's a cyclical wheel of time. And the zodiac, right, is a circle. The sun traverses the circle of the zodiac. Time and aeon. So there's a scholar who has a fascinating piece. It's an older essay. His name's Hans Leisegang. And the piece is The Mystery of the Serpent. And it's the treatment of the mysteries of the serpent in Hellenic thought. So Dionysios is Helios, according to Leisegang. And he makes the argument citing Julian, the emperor. I mean, from the spheres, for this god, by thus dividing them by four, that is, the sky divided into four, a circle divided into four chunks, sends us the fourfold glory of the seasons, right? So the seasons come in this circular pattern, winter, spring, summer, fall. And indeed our ears, and indeed our earth, the graces imitate, in its graces imitate a circle in their statues. And it is Dionysius who is the giver of these graces, and in this very connection he is said to reign with Helios, the sun, Phanes. So we're going to see some more interesting quotes here. As above, so below. Concerning the nature of the universe as above, the above does not appear to be contradicted by Euripides, who is a pupil of the physicist Anaxagoras. For in his Melanippe, which is a work, he espouses the view that heaven and earth were once one form. So as above, so below. So we get from myth to physics via the Orphic mysteries. It is possible, however, that Melanippe's mother was familiar with an Orphic myth, since women were once admitted to the Orphic mysteries. The term archaea didaskalia would suggest an archaic wisdom of the mysteries. The passage in the Ars Rhetorica may possibly go back to a more extensive source, which the author hastily excerpted and failed to understand. It is also possible that Anaxagoras, like most of the pre-Socratic philosophers, reinterpreted old myths in terms of physics. Moreover, the Orphic theologians were themselves physicists, physiologists, who transmuted the mythical gods into the elements and forces of the cosmos. It can be shown that the half-mythical, half-physical doctrine that heaven and earth were originally one form, but were separated by a schism, was another part of the Orphic cosmogony and theogony. In his Argonautica, Apollonius Rhodius explicitly puts this conception, expressed in the same terms, into the mouth of Orpheus. And Orpheus lifted his lyre and left hand and made essay to sing. He sang how earth, the heaven, and the sea once mingled together in one form, and after a deadly strife were separated from one another. Again, Athenagoras. For according to Orpheus, water was the beginning of everything. From water mud was formed, and from these the animals were produced. A dragon that had a lion's head and a bull's head, and in between the face of a god. He was called Heracles, and Chronos, that is time. This Heracles gave birth to an enormous egg, this is also Platonic, which through the power of its father got bigger and bigger, and by friction was burst into two. The top part was heaven, Uranus, and the lower part earth, Gaia. A biform god also came forth, who was Phanes, the glittering one, the winged serpent. There we go. Fascinating stuff. Now we're not done. It's going to get actually even crazier, because sometimes Phanes, who is Helios, is also referred to as Zeus and Pan. So the Orphic Phanes combined in himself all the gods of the cosmic forces we have mentioned, and was of both sexes, hermaphrodite, right? So the Baphomet image of the hermaphrodite is the same as Phanes or Helios, snake and egg. The two halves coming together form the totality of a shell, the totality of creation, the universe. And so, it's a lot of this stuff, it tends to blend together, but Lysagang says, Kronos, according to the Orphic teachings, is the true form of the primal god, Cronus, and father of Zeus. He is the god of time and creator of the Aeon. According to the mythical or mystery thinking, the gods and cosmic forces represented here are not conceived merely as existing successively or side by side. They act upon one another, with one another, and are manifestations of a single God of one and the same cosmos. This also is in the Hermetica, which is the Egyptian view. The Egyptian view says the exact same thing. In the mystery rites, the Mysti, that is the initiates, have been led by the upper way and have attained to the supercelestial region, as above, so below. And so the serpent of the air, the sun, the god of light, Lucifer, perhaps, right? Lucifer seems to be the same as Phanes. And the sun disk, this is where the Egyptians get the idea of the sun disk. So this shows that the theology presented in the Timaeus, which claims to be from Egypt, is the same theology, right? So Lysagang's article is important and backs up the scholarship of Wim van den Dungen that I've cited many times. And the sun is also the all-seeing eye, spoken of here in Lysagang's piece. So an argument is made to that effect, that it's essentially the same as the all-seeing eye of the sun. And so this is why in a lot of Hermetic stuff, the dot in the middle of the circle is not just the monad, but it's also the sun image, right? Because that's actually an Ouroboros. So in Lysagang's piece, the ring of Gyges comes up, and this is why I mention this, because a ring is also a circle. So Lysagang says, concerning this Ouroboros, since the cosmic year is an aeon, the span of life allotted to the cosmos, the Ouroboros, or the snake biting its tail, became the symbol of the aeon, especially when bearing the inscription, what is that in Greek? Into pan, that all things are one, to wit, They arose from the one, from the monad, and they return to the one, so that the aeon extends from the one, capital O, to the one, capital O. The magic papyri include a rule for the manufacture of a ring conferring success, favor, and victory. Interesting. So it's not just in the book To the Republic that we have reference to this magic ring of power. This is, what is the source for this? Magical papyri. The Leiden papyri, Leiden papyri. It is a ring for all success and happiness, much sought after by kings. It is very effective. Take a blue sky jasper and etch on it a snake in the form of a circle with tail in its mouth. In the middle of the snake, make a moon with 2 stars and 2 horns, with 2 stars on its 2 horns, and above them a sun on which is engraved Abraxas, which is Yaldabaoth, the Gnostic deity. On the reverse side of the stone, the name Abrasax, and on the setting inscribed the great and sacred all-powerful name of Lord of Sabaoth. So clearly there's some Christian influence there in this magical papyri from whenever this is from. Who knows? I don't know where the Leiden papyri comes from, but it's another testimony from the ancient Hellenic world to this. Now, I've mentioned many times too that ether is important in Platonism because it is the 5th matter, the subtle quintessence that extends throughout and beyond the material physical realm. Also seems to be some connection to plasma, which is also listed as a 5th element by the Greeks. But when we think of ether, there is an important mention in this same, it's called, it's the Paris Magic Papyri. And this is from Lower Egypt, believed to have been written AD 300. So that's where this comes from. And it's about ether. This is what's neat. Hail, temple of the air spirit. Hail, spirit of the reachest from heaven to earth, which lies in the center of the cosmos, on the borders of the abyss. Hail, spirit who enters into me and takes hold of me, and departs from me in loving kindness as God wills. Hail, beginning of the end and immutable nature. Hail, rotation of the elements in untiring service. Hail, ye spirits of the air demons. Hail, be praised. Hail, ye brothers and sisters, pious men and women. O great spherical unfathomable edifice of the world, heavenly spirit which dwellest in heaven, ethereal spirit which dwellest in the ether, who art dark and who glitters star-like, God of gods with golden eternal wings, God of the aeons, who dwells in the ether. Now you can't tell me that's not interesting. So, more of the Gnostic teachers who also back up the Logoi doctrine, which is interesting, which Maximus the Confessor also teaches. This Parates teaches that the Logos is the serpent. Okay, so some of these Gnostic teachers took some of these principles that we would say are true, and utilize them for their bizarre doctrines. So, 16 giants follow in the train of Aeon, who is, again, the winged serpent sun spirit. Lucifer, it would appear to be. Plotinus likens the ascent of the good and the godly in the mysteries, by which the Neoplatonists always mean the Orphic version of the Eleusinian mysteries. Okay, so the Orphic mysteries are important to Neoplatonism. Plotinus says, to attain it, for those that will take the upward path, divest yourself in this descent, and so approach the holy celebration of the mysteries as they are appointed purifications, the laying aside of the garments worn before, and entry in through nakedness. The aeon of aeons. There's a mystical union with the deity, and of course all this is tied into the seasons and the solstice, and there is a esoteric sign that you are in the mysteries by putting your hand on your breast. So it's the ascent of the soul through the elements back to the one. So that's, again, if you can get a hold of this piece, I highly recommend it for Alexandrian Hermetic Ancient Near Eastern Mystery Studies. It's called The Mystery of the Serpent by Hans Leisegang, and it is printed in the Princeton Bollingen series, papers from the Eranos Yearbook, edited by Joseph Campbell. So that's where you want to get that if you want to get that. So, back to Plato. This is why we have a mention right after the Ring of Gyges of Orpheus and the Orphic Mysteries, as well as a secret society to veil the truths from the masses because they're too stupid. The masses will never grasp this stuff. We can't let them know that. We got to have a secret society and magic rings to keep it out of their mind. So there we go. And then he goes on to discuss the construction of this city. The city needs to have that tripartite structure of masses working, the guardians who are the warriors, the dogs of the philosophers, it would seem. And then at the top, of course, the philosopher king. The philosopher king is the sole dictator, if you will. And in the body correspondence, the masses correspond sort of to the bodily desires to eat and drink and have sex. The guardians correspond to the spirited desires of love, honor, courage, and the philosopher kings correspond to reason. There's interesting discussions of the deity of Zeus, God, and God is conceived of in the theology here, again, is very reminiscent of what I was just reading in Hans Leisegang's piece. It is, of course, not a theology of... Ultimately, it's what's in the Hermetica, and I think that's what's important to understand. So if you can find an online copy of the Hermetica, I would recommend reading that, because you'll see quite clearly that what's presented there is the exact same as what's in Platonism, and ultimately it seems to derive from Egyptian theology. So that's where we're at now. That's the thrust of Book 2. We discussed the guardians and the hierarchy of the Republic. And as we move on to Book 3, we'll have a discussion of Homer and whether or not Homer should be allowed to be, or whether his stories should be censored in the ideal republic. We'll also have the myth of the metals, as it's called, which is where we'll have the correspondence to the three-tiered society and the three-tiered man, to metallurgy, which relates to alchemy. So gold, silver, and bronze come into play here, and we'll have alchemical elements as well. So that concludes Book 2, and we got some pretty deep esoteric stuff there. So ponder those things, and hopefully I'll remember to add my articles that deal with those topics